Breaking race barriers, how business rivals became friends and changed the game forever. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? In New York City, 1958, concrete had a different smell. It wasn't like today's sterile, polished kind. Back then, it reeked of raw power, damp, gritty, with a metallic edge of ambition. It carried the sweat of day laborers, the ash of cigarettes, and the bitter tang of unspoken contempt, especially if you were a black man building upward, higher than the boundaries white society had been drawing for generations. For Jason Blake, this city was never neutral ground. He could read every loaded glance, every limp handshake, every tight-lipped smile that hid fear, not of him exactly, but of what he represented. A Harvard-trained engineer who grew up in the tough streets of Harlem, Jason had carved a path straight through blueprints and traditions that never had someone like him in mind, let alone leading the charge on a primetime construction bid. That spring, his company, Chief Blake and Sons Structures, landed a high-stakes contract to build a luxury apartment complex on the Upper East Side. That wasn't just a project, it was a statement, a fist punching through New York's glass ceiling, a sign that times were changing, and not everyone was thrilled about that. Jason stood on the site, boots covered in dust, blueprint tube slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning a skyline that rarely looked back with kindness. His crew, mostly black men from Harlem and Brooklyn, worked under the roar of cranes and the grind of cement mixers. The city trembled with the sound of progress, like Manhattan itself was resisting this new chapter. But with the contract came the pushback. First it was the concrete, deliveries delayed for no good reason. Then licensing issues, as if paperwork signed in the morning somehow expired by lunch. At City Hall, people looked at him like he'd walked into the wrong room. One clerk, a wiry man with a lazy tie and a face full of apathy, mumbled under his breath, "You're Mr. Blake? Huh. Usually these kinds of jobs go to, He trailed off, letting the sentence rot in the silence. Jason had heard it all before, and he wasn't about to break. One morning he noticed a woman across the street, white, sharp suit, notepad in hand, scribbling notes as she watched the site. 2 days later, the Tribune ran a story. A risky experiment. Can an inexperienced firm guarantee Upper East Side safety? Not a single outright lie in the article, but the truth was twisted funhouse mirror style. All suggestion, all doubt, playing to the fears and biases that never quite stayed buried. His assistant, Ella, a sharp-tongued, whip-smart young black woman, tossed the paper on his desk with a look of pure disgust. They'll never print a damn word about your engineers, or the standards, or your track record. Just black owner, unproven firm, rich neighborhood. Same tune, different verse, enough times and people start humming along. She wasn't wrong. Jason knew the game too well. He'd grown up in moldy tenements where hope came wrapped in lottery tickets. His father had died on a job site. Scaffolding collapsed. An accident, they called it. No investigation, no justice. That day, Jason made himself a promise. He would build something real, not just buildings, a legacy. Now that name was being dragged through the mud. Suppliers started calling with strange delays. Some were honest. We've been told to push your order down the line. Orders from above. Other projects are being prioritized. By other, they meant white-owned, familiar, safe. Names like Michael Randall. Randall ran one of the biggest firms in the city. 8 years older, face like a brick wall, reputation carved from granite. He wasn't stupid, just old world. He didn't hate Jason. He just thought the man was trespassing in a game he had no right playing. When Jason finally brought up the sabotage at a city construction board meeting, the air went still. The room was full of expensive suits and colder eyes. Men who'd mastered the art of smiling without meaning a word of it. Jason laid out his case, facts, documents, numbers. When he finished, the answer came wrapped in polite dismissal. Mr. Blake, we can't interfere with market competition. Supply chains are a free enterprise issue. I'm sure you understand. He did. Late nights found him in his midtown apartment, staring at a blank wall. No view, no comfort. Just the slow boil of frustration. He knew what came next. Harsher attacks, tighter scrutiny, the papers questioning his competence again and again. But he wasn't done. He wasn't playing by rules that were written without him in the room. His company survived on his resolve. His workers believed in him. And every single sack of concrete poured on that east side lot wasn't just material. It was a message. A black engineer, boss, can build luxury high-rises, can run a business, can win. And every day on site, under the noise, the dust, and the doubt, he reminded himself, they're not afraid of me. They're afraid of change. In the darker corners of power, the kind that made decisions behind closed doors, Jason's name had already been spoken. One of those voices, Ray Thompson, lit a cigar in the hush of a private club, eyes on the city skyline he liked to think he owned. He won't last, he said, quiet and venomous. We'll wait. He'll crumble under the weight of his own ambition. But Jason Blake had made a life on the edge, and the concrete beneath his feet, still solid. By the time March rolled into Manhattan, the wind off the East River still had knives in it, but the sun was starting to rise a little higher each day. Steel beams caught the morning light like polished bayonets, and wet concrete steamed faintly in the cold. The city churned with ambition, deals, and that stiff, well-bred politeness of people who wore mink collars and counted power in square footage. Jason Blake stood right in the middle of it all. Too different to be accepted, too damn good to be ignored. Winning the Park Avenue contract should have meant a long string of practical next steps. Budgeting, permits, timelines, deliveries. But Jason quickly learned that he hadn't just stepped into the world of construction, he'd stepped onto a battlefield. And in this war, blueprints and cement weren't your weapons. The real game was played with whispers, handshakes, and a deep, sticky fear of change. The first hits came soft, classy even, like everything else in Eisenhower's America. Friday morning, the cement trucks didn't show up. Monday, a fire took out the subcontractors' filing cabinets. Faulty wiring, they said. By Wednesday, the electricians' union walked off the job, claiming sudden safety violations nobody had noticed before. Jason called, negotiated, showed up in person. Every time he hit a wall of polite shrugs and sideways glances. Suppliers said they were reprioritizing. Project managers suddenly had other obligations. Even an old college buddy, a guy Jason used to split pizza with during finals week, now looked through him like foggy glass. Don't take it personal, Jay, he said, voice flat. It's just business. Jason wasn't naive. He knew exactly who was behind it. Ray Thompson didn't wear Brooks Brothers or pose for city planning articles. He didn't attend board meetings. He owned the buildings where board members met. 38, jaw like a bulldozer, face carved from oak. The kind of man who spotted weak points in others like a wolf smells blood. Ray had made his fortune controlling the veins of the city. Steel, gravel, cement. And if there was one thing Ray Thompson hated, it was being bypassed, especially by a black man, especially on Park Avenue. His motto was simple. If you don't play my game, you don't get the board. Ray had friends in the unions, the kind of guys who broke up fights on Monday and leaked rumors to the press by Friday. He didn't need to act directly, just had to give a signal. And those signals started landing like clockwork. One morning, Vince, the old security guard at the site, found a bundle tied to the gate. Inside, a note. You're backing the wrong man, old-timer. Jason's car? Both front tires slashed, middle of the day. His office? Nothing stolen, but his papers had been moved. Just enough to let him know someone had been there. It wasn't violence. Not yet. But it was war all the same, with different weapons. Jason took the fight to the Construction Development Council. Mahogany tables, cigar smoke, voices that could redraw the skyline with one vote. He walked in with evidence, spreadsheets, delivery logs, timelines, and laid it all out. Sabotage, interference, violations of open competition laws. He might as well have been speaking Greek. We'll take it under review. These things take time. You understand, it's a delicate matter. But he understood more than they thought. Their faces said it all. A black contractor building luxury high-rises on Park Avenue wasn't a possibility to them. It was a threat. As he stepped out into the hallway, a quiet voice called after him. An older man in wire-rimmed glasses, lawyer maybe, leaned close and said under his breath, "You're not the first. You won't be the last, but they'll keep pretending the market's not changing." Then he was gone, like he'd never been there at all. Jason felt the noose tightening. He worked longer hours than anyone in his field, climbed a ladder where every rung had to be fought for. He wasn't there because of some quota. He was there because he earned it, because he was better. His father, a welder from Harlem, used to tell him, "Work twice as hard, son, and they'll still treat you like second rate." Jason never wanted to believe that. Not until Ray Thompson made it personal. The sabotage grew slicker. Newspapers ran editorials with headlines like, "Too much too fast. Is this company overreaching?" Nothing outright racist, but the tone and the doubt dripped from every line. No bylines, just staff editorial. But Jason could see the fingerprints, facts twisted to cast shadows, and every shadow pointed straight back to Thompson's office. One night long after midnight, Jason returned to the site. Only one work light buzzed near the stairs. The steel beams loomed like bones under a pale sky. The air was thick with wet earth, concrete dust, and the iron smell of rain. He moved through the skeleton of his future, bare columns, half-laid foundations, and stopped where the main stairwell would soon lead to polished lobbies and million-dollar apartments. It was quiet. His footsteps echoed off damp walls. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest, not just loneliness and isolation. That deep, cold feeling of standing alone in a city that didn't want you to win unless you bent the knee. He knew something would go wrong tomorrow. Another supplier would pull out. Another inspector might show up with a clipboard and a reason to halt construction. It was war, no guns, no trenches, but losses were real. Time, money, reputation, and respect, which always came last and vanished first. But Jason wasn't backing down. He'd never been that kind of man. His business wasn't just a business. It was proof, living, rising proof, that a black man could build something powerful, lasting, and worthy. He wasn't just pouring concrete. He was laying the foundation for something bigger, a future where he didn't have to apologize for being great. And if that meant going to war, so be it. New York felt especially brutal that morning. The streets of Manhattan, thick with diesel fume, city grime, and damp fall air, pulsed with life. But for Jason Blake, that energy pressed down like a weight, relentless, suffocating. He sat in his fifth-floor office at Blake & Son Structures, a building that looked modest from the outside but was furnished inside with the same precision and care he used back in Harvard's architecture library. Drawing plans late at night, doing calculations to stay awake, not just to pass, but to excel. Dark shadows had settled under his eyes, battle scars from a fight that never let up. The past week had gutted him. Materials vanished from the Brooklyn warehouse. 2 subcontractors pulled out in a single day, one citing bad press, the other blaming union interference. Jason didn't need to ask who was behind it. It was Ray Thompson. It always was. Ray didn't just play rough. He wrote the rules. Slippery, well-connected, and ruthless, with allies planted deep inside unions, committees, and newspaper offices. He could build bridges and burn them behind him without ever smudging his tailored cuffs. When Jason realized he'd been cut off, boxed in from every angle, what he felt wasn't just pressure, it was hopelessness. His appeals to the Construction Development Board went nowhere. Behind closed doors, he heard things the press never printed. This guy's not one of us. We need stable, predictable partnerships, not social experiments. They accused him of provocative behavior just for demanding a level playing field. He wasn't being rejected, he was being rejected by design. That's why the choice he made that morning wasn't about progress, it was survival, a last-ditch move to keep from going under. He called Michael Randall. They hadn't met face-to-face in over a year. In business circles, Michael always carried himself with poise, measured, composed, like a man who'd risen above emotion or noise. He belonged to a different world, a world of marble lobbies and backroom deals. 8 generations of Randalls had laid New York's roads, bridges, and tunnels. You could walk 10 blocks and see a sign that read, "Irk, built by Randall Construction." Michael didn't consider himself a racist, like most of his class. He simply lived in a world where a black man in his boardroom was automatically an outlier, a challenge, a disruption to the natural order. His rivalry with Jason was a strange mix of respect and dismissal. He acknowledged his talent as the exception that proved the rule. They met at a midtown cafe, one of those spots where lawyers, architects, and contractors passed quiet judgment over white tablecloths. The kind of place where the waiters wore gloves and conversations never rose above a murmur. When Jason walked in, the air shifted. No stares, no words, just a faint pause in the room's rhythm. One man raised an eyebrow. Another looked right through him, like he was invisible. The maître d', polite but practiced, escorted him to a table near the wall, even though the room was half empty. Michael arrived right on time. Brooks Brothers suit, soft gray pinstripes, expression like granite. He sat down without offering a handshake. Jason didn't offer one either. The conversation was dry, mechanical. Jason got straight to it. He needed access, protection, a link to the old guard supply chains. Michael listened in silence, his face unreadable, as if running calculations behind his eyes. At one point he asked, "And you really believe I should risk my reputation? For you?" It wasn't sarcasm, it was a genuine question. Jason didn't answer with words. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were invoices, termination letters, subtle threats buried in polite emails. Michael flipped through them. He didn't need to read far. The signature tactics screamed Thompson, and Michael already knew his own company had started losing ground in the Bronx. Rumors said Ray was luring away contractors, offering better deals if they dropped Randall altogether. For the first time, Michael saw the writing on the wall. He was next. After a moment of silence, he said, "This isn't an alliance. It's a transaction, temporary, until we shut Thompson down. No handshake, no toast, just 2 men making a deal the way banks do. Dry, direct, and with quiet calculation. That fragile partnership, born not of trust but mutual threat, marked a turning point. That same evening, Jason sent his engineers to Randall Construction's offices. Together, they began compiling a shared list of suppliers and subs they could safely count on. When one of Randall's senior foremen, a white guy named Calvin Drake, spotted a young black engineer from Blake & Sons, he muttered under his breath, "We working with them now?" Michael happened to walk by. He didn't say anything, but he slowed down. For Jason, this was a new phase. Not just in business, but in his whole approach to the fight. Even in this so-called alliance, every step was friction, distrust, a survival game played with suits and blueprints. He knew partnering with Michael might shield him for now, but it wouldn't fix the system. It meant playing by someone else's rules, and each time he did, a piece of him splintered. For Michael, it was the first time the old guard's safety net felt thin. For the first time, his privilege looked like a target. And with that came a crack, a slow, undeniable fracture in the world he thought was solid. Things started shifting in both offices. People exchanged glances. Rumors spread. In the break rooms, folks whispered about the new arrangement. Some left, unwilling to work in integrated teams. Others stayed, out of pragmatism, fear, or maybe hope. But no one in those buildings could say things would ever go back to the way they were. November in New York came in cold, damp, and gray. A city of steel bones wrapped in concrete skin, soaked in frustration and exhaust fumes. It didn't forgive weakness, and it sure as hell didn't welcome anyone trying to shake the old ways loose. Between skyscrapers, courtrooms, and construction sites, Jason Blake kept moving forward, even as the road ahead narrowed like the neck of a bottle, squeezing him tighter with every step. Things had changed since that meeting with Michael Randall, just not in the way Jason had hoped. The alliance gave him the illusion of protection, but it was becoming clearer by the day. It wasn't a shield, it was a leash. And in a city where power always wore the right skin and spoke with the right kind of polish, a leash meant knowing your place. The first blow came from the bank. Jason applied for a credit extension for a new project, a big residential development on the west side aimed at middle-class families. The paperwork was flawless. His company was growing. Profits were steady. Partnering with Randall Construction should have been a plus. But the moment he stepped into the marble lobby of First Continental Bank and saw the secretary, a white girl in gloves, her hair done up like Doris Day, look him over with polite suspicion, he already knew how this was going to end. "We're sorry, Mr. Blake. Your application doesn't meet the current risk criteria. The committee cannot recommend financing at this time," the manager read off, eyes fixed on his papers like it was a sentencing. No one said what the risk actually was. No mention that just yesterday they approved a similar request from a white-owned company with less revenue. They didn't say, "because you're black." Nobody said that out loud anymore. Instead, they had phrases like insufficient transparency, concerns over leadership, Kishori, heightened public sensitivity around your development. New words for the same old disgust. When Jason told Michael, he just shrugged. He was used to a system that worked in his favor. In his world, a denied loan meant a few phone calls, dinner at the club, and a signature by Friday. He didn't get that Jason didn't have a club, or a last name that echoed on Wall Street, or a grandfather who'd built bridges across the Hudson. "You just have to convince them," Michael said. Not unkindly, but with a tone that showed just how little he understood. Jason didn't answer. Michael wasn't a bad man. He just lived in a different New York, a parallel city where you didn't have to prove anything because someone already did it for you. And that was enough. A week later, the cops showed up on one of the job sites. No warning. Bronx, tough neighborhood. 3 white officers walked through the site with clipboards and that look, like they were already expecting trouble. First, they checked the license, then work visas. One of Jason's foremen, a black man named Jeremy, got grabbed by the shoulder when he tried to explain the papers were in the trailer. "Lot of you guys out here," one cop muttered, scanning the crew. "You building apartments or setting up a gang?" Jason stepped in, hands open, voice calm, polite, careful. He knew that feeling, the choke in the chest, the taste of humiliation, when you're forced to apologize for being who you are. One wrong word and they'd find a reason. Later, he told Michael. He furrowed his brow, confused. "We've never had anything like that happen," he said. "Like that explained it. Maybe someone overreacted?" But this wasn't an overreaction. It was the system. And it wasn't over. The inspections came back 2 more times. Word spread that the authorities were looking for illegals. The next week, half the crew didn't show up. They were scared. And once again, Michael didn't know what to do. He understood ruthless competition. He didn't understand having to fight just to exist. But the worst came in court. One of the competitors filed a lawsuit claiming Blake and Sons was violating building codes. The judge, silver-haired, with a jaw like a blueprint and a voice that hissed through his teeth, allowed himself certain casual remarks. "Your methods, Mr. Blake, may be innovative," he said, "but I'm not sure they align with the traditions of our professional community." The room, packed with white lawyers, watched Jason like a sideshow. His documents were picked over with surgical precision, every comma scrutinized. When Michael spoke, the judge interrupted politely. When Jason did, it was with condescension, like a student being scolded in class. Outside in the brittle November air, Michael walked in silence longer than usual. Something had shifted, not rage, not even pity. Something quieter, a discomfort. The crack had formed, not guilt, not yet, but something close, a flicker of recognition that his world was built on foundations that, for others, were walls. Their dynamic changed. Michael started showing up at sites more often. At first, he said it was to keep things on track, but Jason saw it for what it was. He wanted to see. He watched Jason talk with workers, fix errors in blueprints, climb girders himself when something didn't look right. He saw the way Jason earned respect from men who still called him the black boss behind his back. There was no fear in him, no whining, just that same quiet resolve. Keep going, don't break. And Jason, for his part, started seeing Michael too, not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as someone raised in a bronze cage where you're told from birth, you're the best. And when someone comes along who proves that wrong, not with talk, but with work, it shakes something loose. Jason began to see not just an heir, but a hostage. One night, late, the job site long asleep and only a hammer echoing somewhere in the dark, they stood together on a makeshift platform on the fourth floor. Below them, the city stretched out in lights and noise. Michael looked toward the horizon and said softly, "I didn't know it went this deep." Jason said nothing, because he knew, while some were just learning, others were already living it. But for the first time, maybe, he didn't feel completely alone. The morning was cold and quiet, quiet like a Sunday street before sunrise when the city holds its breath. A thick ceiling of gray clouds hung low over the Upper East Side, threatening rain. But the rain held back, as if even the sky was waiting for something bigger to fall. Outside the construction site, the one that had become a symbol of Jason Blake's ambition, shadows were slowly gathering. Between the fifth and sixth floors, rebar jutted out like exposed nerves, and there was a tension in the air, the kind only seasoned people could feel. Something was off, though no one could say what. Jason arrived at 7 sharp. He looked tired but focused. His tailored coat, leather gloves, and spotless hard hat gave him a quiet authority. He walked past stacks of concrete, nodding to the workers, mostly Irish and Italian, with a handful of black laborers doing the hardest jobs. The men acknowledged him with polite distance, but not warmth. Not because he was strict, but because he was a black boss. A contradiction to their idea of how the world was supposed to work. Jason had long since learned to tell the difference between suspicion and outright hostility. But that morning, the suspicion felt razor sharp. Around 9 it happened. A deep, sickening crack, like a spine snapping in half. Not a sound concrete is supposed to make. Then chaos. The 6th floor, still not fully reinforced, started folding like a house of cards. Dust exploded into the air like a confession of fear, mistakes, sabotage. Slabs of concrete crashed down, bringing scaffolding, tools, boards with them. And under that weight was Jose Mendez, 25, a Mexican laborer working off the books at the site foreman's request. He never stood a chance. His ribs, his skull crushed instantly. Sirens, first fire trucks, then ambulances, then the cops. Jason stood at the edge of the collapse, hands jammed deep in the pockets of his coat. his face pale but eyes steady. He knew this wasn't bad luck. It wasn't an accident. This was intentional, calculated, cold. Someone wanted to do more than stop the build. They wanted to destroy what he was building. All of it. Michael Randall showed up later, furious, but not at Jason. His anger was quiet, coiled, aimed at how fast the whole thing had spiraled. He knew Ray Thompson's tactics, and while he'd always stayed out of other men's wars, this was different now. One of his suppliers had just backed out of a deal, saying flatly, "I don't need business with Negroes or anyone who partners with them." That crossed a line. The rest of the day was a blur of questions, incident reports, and inspections. The police treated Jason like he might have staged the whole thing himself, just to frame a rival. One cop, tall, blonde, with a Brooklyn accent and a chip on his shoulder, leaned in and said quietly, off the record, "You know, Blake, maybe you ought to stick to the small stuff. This one's too big for you. Just saying." He said it like a warning, dressed as advice. Jason didn't answer. He just stared him down, silent. And that silence weighed more than any words. That evening, Jason and Michael met at Martha Wells' apartment on Fifth Avenue. Her place was a time capsule. Gold trim, marble floors, Persian rugs, and the faint scent of perfume and wine that hadn't been touched in years. She sat wrapped in a shawl by the fireplace, her face a map of fine wrinkles and fresh makeup, looking tired of a world she believed was growing filthier and dumber by the day. She listened. About the collapse, about the death, about Ray. Then she said, "Ray Thompson was a pig back in '42 when he stole contracts out from under my husband. But now he's dangerous. He's not just a player anymore. He's a wrecking ball." Her tone wasn't warm. It was business. Martha wasn't sentimental, but she was powerful, and she had receipts. She handed them over. Fake invoices, letters from bribed inspectors, records of deals made through shell companies. All of it. She gave them to Michael and Jason like handing off weapons, not out of kindness, out of revenge. She had her own score to settle with Ray. Old, personal, painful. And she wanted these two men she used to look down on, to do the damage she couldn't. Meanwhile, the rumors were already spreading through the site. Some said the support beams had been tampered with. Others swore they'd seen strangers sneaking around the night before. A black security guard, a war vet named Leroy, said the cameras were shut off the day before the collapse. But his statement, somehow lost in the paperwork, for Jason, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reckoning. Until now, he'd been fighting for his name. Now he was fighting for his key right to exist, to build, to lead, to be a black businessman in America without being treated like a threat just for showing up. Inside, something shifted. His determination hardened. It wasn't about being liked anymore, or finding allies. Now he understood. If you want to survive, you fight. If you want to win, you outthink, outmaneuver. Michael saw it too. Jason was changing, and so was he. The more Michael watched, the more he saw a man being crushed by the same system that could have crushed him too. And in that, there was danger, but also respect. By the next morning, they had filed a court petition. An official investigation had begun. It wasn't just about the death of a worker anymore. It was about something bigger. Was this an accident or industrial sabotage? Michael brought in his lawyers. Jason called up community groups. They weren't just business partners now. They were allies on the same front line. Something shifted in the story that day. There was no neutral ground anymore. You were either in the fight or you disappeared. New York, sparkling on the outside, was rotting from within, and every brick, every steel beam had become part of a battleground. The collapse was no longer just a tragedy. It was a symbol of a deeper breakdown, of how far everyone had gone past the point of no return. The trial that kicked off in mid-January 1959 wasn't some thunderclap out of nowhere. It was a storm that had been building for months. The press could no longer look the other way. Headlines ranged from outright hostile to carefully diplomatic, depending on who owned the paper and the color of their skin. Some covers shouted, "Black developer tries to topple white construction empire," while others, more cautious, called it a milestone in the fight for business equality. But in basements, on job sites, and in high-rise offices across the city, folks knew the truth. It wasn't just Ray Thompson's company on trial. It was the whole damn system. A system built to make sure men like Jason Blake never made it too far up the ladder. The courtroom was an old stone building on Lafayette Street, with marble walls and the smell of wood smoke and old tobacco still clinging to the panels. It reeked of a time when skin color decided your worth, when a man's life could be measured by the weight he could lift or the silence he could hold. Jason walked in with no smile. His suit, custom-tailored midnight blue with a simple tie, was flawless. His face was calm, but beneath the surface he felt the heat of 1,000 stares. Some friendly, some waiting to see him fall. He didn't fear for his freedom. He feared for his right to be who he was, unapologetically, without asking permission. Michael Randall walked beside him, looser in his stride but tight behind the eyes. Something had changed in him. Over the past few months, through all the sabotage, the lies, the collapse at the site, they'd cracked something open. He no longer saw Jason's reality as other. He saw how the system worked and how he'd been a pillar holding it up. Now stepping into that courtroom, he wasn't just backing a business partner. He was stepping away from the world he once called home. The evidence they presented was thorough. Statements from workers, audio tapes, signed documents. Every piece pointed to the same truth. What happened on that construction site wasn't an accident. It was deliberate sabotage orchestrated by Ray's people. Ray, of course, didn't show. His lawyers tried to spin it, blame flawed blueprints, unreliable witnesses, reckless ambition on Jason's part. One even sneered, "Mr. Blake seems to think a Harvard degree makes him an equal in this town." The room went silent. Not out of respect, out of tension. Jason didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just looked the judge in the eye, and in that quiet gaze was something stronger than any speech. Calm defiance. He wasn't there for applause. He was there to make sure the truth couldn't be ignored. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Martha Wells took the stand. Elegant as ever, dressed in a pale coat with her silver hair pulled back and a heavy ring catching the sunlight like a signal flare. She spoke plainly, with no flair for drama, and laid it all out. Her meetings with Ray, the blackmail, the payoffs, the threats against union heads. And most importantly, she made it clear. This wasn't just about business. It was ideology. Ray didn't sabotage Jason because he feared competition. He did it because he believed men like Jason had no business owning anything at all. When the jury came back, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. The verdict was clear. Ray Thompson's company was guilty of corruption, of industrial sabotage, of conspiracy to destroy a rival. When the judge read the final ruling, Jason closed his eyes. It wasn't a moment of victory. Not really. He'd never wanted to win this way. It was a necessity, paid for in pain, fear, and someone else's death. The press had a field day. Photos of Jason and Michael standing on the now rebuilt construction site ran in the New York Times, the Amsterdam News, even Time magazine. But the real story didn't live in headlines. That spring, something new was born. Blake Randall Developments, the first joint construction firm in New York history, co-owned by a black man and a white man. It wasn't a business move. It was a message. Their first project, a housing complex on the edge of Harlem in the Upper West Side, a line on the map that had always divided the city. Now it was a bridge, and not just in concrete. On that site, for the first time, mixed crews worked side by side. No quotas, no backdoor deals, just people hired for the job. Michael, who once said business has no place in politics, was now showing up at union meetings, pushing for fair contracts. He still stumbled, still got things wrong, but his change was real. He no longer hesitated to shake Jason's hand in front of a crowd. And Jason, tired, bruised, and carrying more scars than he let show, knew he had done the impossible. He didn't defeat racism, but he'd proved that it could be resisted, that you didn't have to accept the rules, that you could build anyway. New York, of course, stayed the same, shiny on the outside, rotting at the core. The problems didn't disappear, but in one corner of the city there now stood a building whose foundation carried more than steel and stone. It carried a story about a black man and a white man, rivals, enemies, opposites, who built something that could hold more than weight. It could carry a hope. In one of his last interviews that fall, a reporter asked Jason if he believed anything had really changed. He thought for a moment, then said, "Steel doesn't pick sides. Maybe we don't have to either. But if that's ever going to happen, somebody's got to be the first to lay it down." And that was his steel, his story, his city.